So now that's all right. Great. Okay. Yeah. So thanks very much for the introduction, and thanks for inviting me. What I'm speaking about today is some elements of the book project, which I'm currently finishing off the final manuscript drafts, which is originally sort of developed taking my earlier interests in relationships between different disciplines and ideas of the past and their significance for wider cultural, wider ideological forces, but kind of going quite a bit back in terms of the period of the past that's being received, and also expanding in the geographic scope of the areas which I'm looking at. So what this project is, which is currently entitled The Age of Mammals, Nature Development and Paleontology in the Long 19th Century, is an international history looking at the development of research on fossil mammals. So a history of paleontology project, but not focusing on the obvious side of things, which most of the historical literature has focused on in terms of the history of paleontology, which would be dinosaurs, but the later period of the development of mammals and creatures which are sort of very often incorporated and linked within human development too. So within this project, I'm interested in doing two major things. The first is a kind of geographic or a kind of cross-contextual perspective. So looking at how scientific power, cultural authority and ideology work between different places and different intellectual and different cultural contexts in the 19th century. So within this, the project itself is looking at quite a large geographic scope. So it's looking at, the prime focus is on Britain, France, the German lands, and the United States, but it also examines quite a bit the kind of global and colonial entanglements of these countries. So that's really one strand of argument and one strand of interest within this project. But the other side, which I'm very interested in, is thinking about how this newly elaborated deep past of familiar organisms becomes a crucial way of understanding modern nature, modern animals in the 19th century, and becomes a really constitutive force, and becomes tied in with debates and competing controversies and ideas over things like progress, time, and development. So that's the main project I'm currently working on. As Stephanie also said, I'm currently working on this collaborative project between Paris and KCL entitled Valuing Nature, Everyday Engagement with the Natural World in Britain, France and Their Empires, 1700 to the present. And this is almost asking kind of quite parallel questions to the larger research project that I'm working on, of thinking about how the natural world has been valued, how it's been understood, and how it's been engaged with across the modern period, across various different geographic contexts, and also thinking about things in quite a practical way, so not just kind of cultural or intellectual ways of thinking, but actual sort of physical, practical activity. So what I'm going to be doing in this project is really in this presentation, is really linking these two projects. So on the one hand, giving you an overview of some aspects of my Age of Mammals project, but also potentially thinking about how the history of mammal paleontology in the 19th century can also be connected to different ways, different understandings and different valuations of the natural world. Now, in terms of the kind of broader historiographic context that I'm working with within this project, is the history of paleontology and the deep time sciences has developed into quite a large-scale field, and particularly over recent years there's very much been a large-scale renaissance or a very large-scale expansion of work in this area over the last few years. And this historiography has really gone in two major directions. The first is thinking about how this idea of a very deep chronology history for the Earth is elaborated over the course of the late 18th and 19th centuries through a mixture of, on the one hand, new scholarly approaches, so based around looking at rocks, looking at fossils, looking at geological formations and so on, but also a large amount of imaginative and often kind of artistic elements. So literature, art, visual culture becomes key to sort of understanding and comprehending this new, almost unfathomably vast and often very strange geological history. So that's one sort of area, and sort of key books which have kind of engaged with that have been, the works of Martin Rudwick, who was a kind of major pioneer of this, and also Ralph O'Connor's excellent book, The Earth on Show. But more recently, there's been an additional additional sort of strand which has been using the history of paleontology and the earth sciences in the 19th century and thinking about them very much as subjects which aren't just about cultural or intellectual changes, but are actually very strongly connected with economic, political, and colonial power, and how the search for fossils and how the comprehension of fossils is tied up with the extraction of new mineral resources, transitions to industrial economies, and also the establishment of colonial control over various parts of the world. And so this has been put forward very strongly by Lucas Riepel in his book Assembling the Dinosaur, which makes very strong links between the growth of dinosaur paleontology and the growth of American capitalism in the latter part of the 19th century, and also Pratik Chakrabarty's excellent recent book, Inscriptions of Nature, which thinks about how the deep time sciences become connected with lots of different colonial projects within India across the 19th century. So we've got a kind of good literature in terms of a few sort of set pieces or kind of clear periods within the history of the deep time sciences and paleontology. So a lot has focused on early modern and early 19th century Europe, with fossils becoming understood in various different ways, which sort of mix together new ways of thinking about the age of the earth, but also very often recapitulating or reworking older religious ideas, particularly around the flood and the deluge and things like this. And then also a large amount of work is also focused on Georges Cuvier in Paris, and sort of this new way of understanding and analysing fossil organisms as sort of representatives of past and lost worlds. There's also been quite a lot of work on 19th century Britain, particularly in relation to the connections between the paleontological and deep time sciences and culture, and in terms of popular culture and literary culture. So I've already mentioned Ralph O'Connor's work, but this has sort of looked at how various means of literary engagement with the past become sort of very strongly entangled with geology. And also there's been a lot of work done on the Crystal Palace dinosaurs, so these huge kind of models of prehistoric life in southeast London as ways of kind of presenting and documenting and understanding the life of the past. And then alongside that, there's also been a lot of work on the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century in the United States, which is a period when you see a very large amount of very high profile and very widely publicized, particularly dinosaur discoveries and dinosaur excavations, which form the nucleus of large American museums, like the American Museum of Natural History in New York or the Carnegie Museum in Pittsburgh. And this becomes one of the first large-scale sciences where American institutions really become world leaders in very important ways, and it becomes very importantly connected to American national and cultural identity in very particular ways. So in terms of the expansion onto the frontier, and in terms of mastering the sort of landscape and the geology. So that's where the literature is, and the literature does tend to be quite focused either on large-scale understandings or large-scale investigations of how this new geological past is itself elaborated, or tends to focus on possibly the most spectacular or the most high-profile or the most currently resonant aspect of paleontology, which would obviously be dinosaurs. This is the kind of immediate thing if you mention paleontology to any sort of modern sort of audience. What they immediately think of, dinosaurs, because that's sort of in the kind of cultural arena. But what I found was very, very interesting when I first started looking at the history of paleontology, and particularly the history of 19th century paleontology, is dinosaurs are present, they're sort of there, they have very particular meanings attached to them. But in terms of what vertebrate paleontologists were particularly interested in, they seem to devote far, far, far more attention to fossil mammals. So these more recent creatures, which are often sort of more familiar and more comprehensible, than they did to dinosaurs. And so I was thinking, okay, that's interesting. No one's really looked at this, and why is this? And so over the course of this project, I've come to a variety of conclusions on why mammals are particularly regarded as interesting or significant in the 19th century. The first is that they're conceptualized as being simultaneously abundant, so there's lots of them, but also very diverse. So you've got different types of mammals living in all different types of environments. So you've got swimming seals, you've got whales, you've got flying bats, you've got sloths hanging from trees, you've got carnivorous big cats and canids and so on, and you've got a very wide variety of herbivores and so on. And so the mammals almost show a very, very wide extent of how nature can diversify, how nature can diverge, and it gives a series of case studies on natural variation, which scholars and public audiences in the 19th century are very interested in, both because of debates over evolution on the one hand, but also because of understandings of how does nature work, how does nature fit together, how is nature sort of subdivided. As well as that, mammals are also regarded as significant in the 19th century because of ideologies over progress and development. So mammals aren't just conceptualized as being diverse and abundant, they're also conceptualized as being almost the best animals. They're conceptualized as being at the pinnacle of natural creation, so the most advanced type of creature. And this is partly coming from biological analyses, so looking at sort of mammal circulation and mammal sort of brain functioning and so on, but it also connects with more cultural and also often more kind of emotional valuations. There's an idea that mammals have advanced and developed family lives, which kind of recapitulates human society. They have social organization, they have more complex emotional lives than things like reptiles would, according to the Victorian conceptualization, and so they're simultaneously thought of as being more easy for humans to empathize with. They're also conceptualized as being progressive and advanced because they're the type of animal which is closest to humans. And they're also kind of useful for a whole lot of attempts to valorize and conceptualize various values, both around animals but also around human society. So there's one of the few studies of the way that the category of mammals is understood in the 18th and 19th century is a really, really fantastic article by Londa Schiebinger called Why Mammals Are Called Mammals. And in this, she makes an argument about the fact that mammals are basically named for breastfeeding, essentially. That's where the term comes from. She makes a very kind of clear argument that this is connected strongly with changing gender roles and attempts to sort of naturalize particular roles for women within society, that women are basically designed to give birth and look after children. And so that becomes a naturalized process. And so that's one aspect of this, but there are all sorts of different ways that mammals are used and become good to think with. And then finally, another issue around why mammals are particularly interested in the 19th century is they're also conceptualized as being uniquely useful for humans. So most of the most iconic or the most widely used domesticated animals in the 19th century are mammals, so horses, cows, pigs, sheep, and so on. And these become bred and expanded in huge numbers in the 19th century. And also, animal byproducts from lots of different mammals are also used very, very extensively. So we can think about, whale oil and baleen. We can think about ivory, which becomes very important, and fur, leather, all sorts of things, which mean mammals are very closely connected with various economic forces as well. So this means that mammals become particularly interesting in the 19th century for a whole range of reasons. But they're not, and this is a kind of core point of the project, mammals aren't just conceptualized as being interesting for these factors in themselves, in the present, in the current world, but they're given a history, they're given a narrative, they're given an entire age of the earth when they were sort of regarded as dominant over creation, as humans are conceptualized as being dominant over the modern period. So this idea that the age of mammals, the sort of period after the extinction of the dinosaurs and before the appearance of humans, which is often self-consciously called the age of man, so the Victorians do have a very definite concept, quite analogous to our concept of the Anthropocene, for example. Then the mammals are sort of in this period, they're developing, they have a history, and this history is important for tracing their development, but it's also important for explaining and valorizing the contemporary world, contemporary animals, and contemporary nature. So what I'm going to do over the next few minutes, over the next half an hour or so, I might not actually get through all these case studies, but we'll see how we go, is trace how these sort of processes work across a series of different areas which I'm looking at various different parts of the book. I've selected these specifically because this is a kind of Anglophone studies unit, so these are all primarily British world sort of topics, so there will be a bit of Germany and France and the US coming up at various different times. But if people do want to ask in the Q&A session about how things work in other parts of the world in similar sort of issues, very happy to say so. But anyway, so what we're going to be looking at, we're going to firstly be looking at how fossil mammals become important for understanding and representing urban environments, and specifically urban environments in London, which becomes a really important paleontological site in the 19th century. We're then going to move to a more conceptual section, thinking about how reflections on mammals and ordering of particular types of mammals and thinking about this history of the Age of Mammals becomes very important for a real major scientific and cultural preoccupation, particularly in the later 19th century, which is biogeography. So a kind of field of research which is trying to work out why particular animals live in particular regions, why they form particular communities, and what this means about particular landscapes. And then if we have time at the end, we'll be going to South Australia, which has some interesting implications around how these ideas about progress valuation of the animal world develops, but also has kind of quite interesting things around geography and the extent of these debates and issues. So if we start off then in London and southeast England, then a lot of the kind of iconography and cultural self-conception around paleontology and the deep time sciences often presents it in terms of rugged masculine figures going to the wilderness, going to sort of the desert, the badlands and so on, testing themselves against the environment and finding and retrieving fossils and treasures and so on. And that's a very important part of the self-conception of particular branches of paleontology and geology in lots of different parts of the world. But in terms of the actual how stuff and how fossils actually get dug up, that's often a kind of minority of what's actually happening. And particularly in the 19th century, what tends to be much more important for excavations, for finding fossils, for finding material, actually tends to be the very large amount of digging and excavation which is being done as part of the 19th century economy and as part of the 19th century development of urban environments, of mining, and these sorts of areas. So miners, construction workers and so on dig up far more fossils than kind of self-conscious paleontologists in the 19th century. This is just sort of happening. This is particularly, I find this particularly interesting or noteworthy in terms of urban environments and particularly in terms of London in the 19th century, because from the, really from the 18th century all the way up until the present, London is subjected to a very large amount of digging and excavation. So if we're thinking about the 19th century, we have the metropolitan sewers being built, we have the underground railway, and we just have a lot of building projects generally going on, which are digging into the earth, finding, sort of excavating lots of material and constructing this new gigantic modern metropolis. However, as that's happening, the workers are finding a lot of fossils, because just to kind of give a quick introduction to the kind of materiality of the geology, London is sort of built over a sort of ice age basin, an ice age river basin, which during the sort of the Pleistocene period, so the period immediately before the one we're currently living on, was inhabited by a very, very large range of quite large animals. So this is one example of things which are of a series of animals and fossils which are found near Charing Cross, so very close to Trafalgar Square and very close to my university, which are found in the 1880s. And you can see this is being reported on in the Illustrated London News, so a major important periodical publication in the 19th century. And you can see there's the remains of mammoth, rhino, aurochs, these big sort of prehistoric cattle, giant deer, lions, hyenas, deer, all sorts of creatures are being taken out out of the earth of the metropolis as the city is being built. And this leads to a very large range of reflections on how these kind of modern processes are bringing people into contact with the deep time and the deep past. But also thinking about sort of valuations of the modern and the kind of prehistoric world in these kind of aesthetic senses, and just trying to sort of make sense of this ancient sort of environment and how it had developed, and also kind of likening it and connecting it to other parts of the world which are being sort of made known to Victorian British audiences and being inscribed with particular ideas about antiquity and nature and so on. So this is one quote from what's really a kind of historical work on the River Thames produced in the 1850s, which is talking about how the bosom of that river which now bears upon it the wealth of the old and new continents, to add to the luxury of the greatest city in the civilized world, once swept a mighty torrent through forests of palms. So thinking about both the massive extent of contemporary British commercial culture, but this very deep antiquity when the sort of environment itself was sort of rhinos, hippos, elephants, and so on, and was similar in most respects to the vast plains of Central Africa. So becomes connected with these kind of colonial ideologies about sort of far-off distant regions. This gets projected into the past, and so the past of Britain becomes conceptualized as being like the present of Africa, which obviously has very huge ideological resonances with milking Africa out as being a sort of primitive, lost sort of area. And this does sort of become a kind of consistent feature in ideas about the history of London and the history of the city, that prior to the development of the modern buildings, the modern urban infrastructure and so on, it was this site of a huge natural sort of environment, almost this kind of paradise-like, Eden-like sort of environment, full of the kind of wallowing hippos, the mammoths and so on, with the ghostly Nelson's column behind it, so you get the kind of juxtaposition of the ancient and the modern city. So that's a kind of general overview of what's sort of happening in London. And what I'm going to do is just focus on one particular set of case studies, which also shows some issues, which kind of shows a bit more around these issues, and particularly the social and kind of political basis around this expansion of urban paleontological infrastructure in London, but also connects it with scientific institutions and also the kind of the materiality of what's kind of going on. For this, we need to go into the sort of eastern areas a bit beyond the city. So what you can see on this map, it's a bit sort of faded, but hopefully you can see it okay, is on this side you can see that this is the old East End of London, with obviously all of its associations of poverty and sort of and kind of urban squalor and so on. But then further east, you've got a whole area which is currently part of the city in sort of West Ham, Ilford, and so on. But in this period is undergoing a huge amount of economic and sort of social transformation as urban settlement is kind of moving into this area, which was formerly primarily farmland and kind of riverine sort of transport, and is building up a new urban and a new a new sort of urban conglomeration, which is sort of a bit administratively separate from London itself, but is growing up in West Ham and the River Lee as a major site of settlement, a major site of habitation, but also a major site of industry and construction, because this area is very good for excavating gravel and very good for excavating sort of clay and so forth to make bricks and so on, which becomes part of the huge infrastructure and the kind of the raw materials which are feeding into the city. However, as with the building of the Metropolitan Railway and various sort of urban infrastructures within central London, while these brickworkers are excavating the brick earths in places like Ilford, West Ham and so on, they're also excavating lots of fossils. So they're finding the remains of, again, hippo, rhino, elephants and various other sort of prehistoric creatures. So this becomes a major sort of source of interest for both the local population, but particularly interested, fairly elite scholarly figures. So lots of mammoth tusks, for example, are taken out of the brick earth and so on, and put in churches or pubs and so on, and so that becomes part of the urban infrastructure. But probably the most prolific collector of material from this part of the kind of part in the eastern fringes of London is this character, Antonio Brady, who is in terms of his job, he is a fairly senior clerk within the Navy. So he works sort of organising provisions for the Victorian Navy, which obviously has a core sort of importance for British imperial power. But he's also a resident of Stratford, so this east part of London, and uses a large part of his social connections and his quite considerable salary to build up within his own house a very, very large collection of, eventually it amounts to over 1,000 fossils of elephants, hippo, rhino, all these kind of large Pleistocene animals. And the way that this gets done is he has a series of sort of social networks and a series of sort of friends in various different areas. So he's very closely connected with figures in what becomes the Natural History Museum. He also has a very dear friend called Mrs. Curtis, who owns a particularly large brick pit, which has lots of people working on it, and sort of mobilizes and leverages these connections to really become an immediate figure that people will get in touch with whenever particularly interesting fossils are found in the brick pits. So essentially what happens is if workers find a particularly interesting fossil within the brick earth, then they send a telegram to Antonio Brady. Antonio Brady then comes with a team of his own workers, pays the brick workers to kind of have some time off while his own team excavates the fossils, and then takes the fossils back to his house, and ends up spending quite a lot of money on this. He estimates it costs overall, I think, £1,000 in sort of mid-19th century money, which is a very, very large amount. And this he kind of justifies in a mixture of terms, in terms of both national pride. So England is, I feel, the original home birthplace of this noble science of paleontology, of geology, but also it has a kind of religious and theological value. So Brady is still working within a context where knowledge of the deep past of the earth and understanding a sort of divinely ordered creation are basically part of the same project. So he thinks of looking, to look through nature to nature's God, and this is why he's kind of interpreting and collecting these fossils. So that's kind of what's going on. And just to kind of give you an idea of, this is very, very hard and complicated work that requires quite a lot of expertise to actually get this fossil material out the ground. So this is Brady's prize specimen, which I think you can either see the original or a cast in the Natural History Museum in London. I'm not quite sure which. I've never got to the bottom of that. But this is called the Ilford Mammoth, which is a complete mammoth skull with both tusks attached, which is actually very, very rare to find, which is found in the mid-1860s. It's regarded as such an important find that Brady doesn't dare excavate it himself, but actually calls in a team from the Natural History, from what's then the British Museum, to arrange the excavation. It's very, very fragile because it's just been taken out of the earth, and it's also quite sodden. And the kind of way that he terms it and describes it, it's interesting in terms of both the materiality of the fossil, but also how it's related to various other issues around antiquity, but also the kind of labour and expertise that's required to actually get this thing out of the earth, get it transported, get it preserved, get it hardened, and get it transformed into a kind of usable museum specimen. So so when it's kind of excavated, it's friable as decayed wood or tinder, so very risky of kind of just crumbling to pieces, and so it needs to be swathed with bandages of canvas like a mummy, so kind of related to another aspect of the deep past. And then you require 6 men to turn it over gently and place it on a kind of plank and a stand and so on. So actually dealing with the materiality of this stuff requires a lot of expertise and a lot of kind of care and a lot of importance. So the Ilford Mammoth itself is regarded as so important that it's not deposited in Brady's own museum in his house, but is actually donated to the Natural History Museum in London quite quickly. But then as we get into the 1860s and 1870s, Brady starts wanting a more permanent home for his collection and thinks it should be donated to some kind of established institution and some kind of public institution for the elevation of both the public, but also to feed into these ideologies around understanding this divinely ordered natural world, which is kind of knowable from fossils and rocks in Britain. So initially, Brady wants to use it to follow through various philanthropic ventures that he's engaged with. So he initially wants to donate it to what's called the East London Museum, which is founded in the 1870s in Bethnal Green, and it eventually becomes the Bethnal Green Museum, and I think it's now now it is the Victoria and Albert Museum of Childhood. But it's established in the East End of London in this sort of area, which is almost a kind of byword in this period for kind of social investigation and kind of philanthropy and sort of and poverty and so on, as a means of kind of elevating the kind of local population. So it's the original home of Richard Wallace's collection of Renaissance and kind of great masters art and decorative art. And the idea is that the benighted population of the East End would go to the East London Museum, see the elevated works, and become sort of civilized and so on. So very strongly tied to these agendas. So Brady initially wants to donate it to this institution, but this institution, the East London Museum, doesn't want it in the end. They don't really have the funds to pay what Brady is sort of asking for it. And as well as that, I think that another sort of aspect is just the space constraints of this institution would have been quite extensive, because if you're dealing with over 1,000 mammoth bones and so on, that's a large amount of material which you do need to have a lot of space for. But it is sort of interesting that Brady does want to initially donate it to this local institution, and this institution which is devoted to elevating the tastes and habits of the working men, my neighbours at the East End, because it's sort of connecting with ideologies around both civic pride but also kind of urban improvement, urban regeneration. So this is what fossils are seen as doing, being part of the same process that and having the same impact that works like the old masters and kind of Renaissance art might. Instead, though, Brady eventually does donate it to the British Museum of Natural History. So, again, following his links with this institution, which are quite extensive by this period. And this is a kind of quite coordinated campaign where Brady works with the curator of geology, Henry Woodward, to draw up a whole catalogue of his fossils, and sort of explains why this is a particularly valuable and particularly important collection. Because it can trace the progress and change of life on Earth, showing the many varieties of comparatively recent extinct animals, and again shows the forms of life which existed in the extinct forests and marshes, and now the site of London, and also these animals being again similar to animals which can be seen in other parts of the world in the current in the sort of current time. So this is eventually successful. Brady sells his collection at quite a discount. He estimates it's worth, he spent 1,000 guineas, so that's slightly over £1,000 on the collection, but he sells it for 500 guineas to the Natural History Museum, so that's half price more or less, on the condition that it's always kept as a single block collection. It's not divided up and it always bears his name, so it has this kind of issues around posterity and his own kind of pride and so on. But just so you can see what the kind of collection is like, this is the very overcrowded fossil galleries in the natural history world. What's then the British Museum, which still has the natural history displays up until the 1870s and 1880s. And you can see the Ilford Mammoth is that one there. So that's the Ilford Mammoth, and it's kind of alongside an American mastodon, an Indian fossil elephant, and a South American giant sloth. So this is the kind of, the old and quite consciously overcrowded displays at the British Museum galleries. But then when the natural history collections moved to South Kensington in the 1880s, then they're given this much sort of grander and this much more open and sort of vista-like arrangement. So visitors can sort of follow this idealized sort of trend of kind of walking around the objects, treating them with almost sort of religious awe in the cathedral-like building, and using them to improve themselves, gain knowledge knowledge of the natural world, and also with this idea that paleontology and fossils is at a very important kind of entry point for people to become sort of first interested and first sort of engaged with natural history and understandings of the natural world. So it has this kind of, again, this sort of elevatory kind of ideological implication. So that's London. And what I'm going to be talking about next is zooming out quite a bit and thinking about the more theoretical and the more and a more kind of conceptual area where paleontology and fossils and ideas of the deep past become particularly significant, but also become particularly connected to wider conceptions and wider valuations of the modern natural world. And this is something which has really come out of the project quite a lot, where if we talk about or we think about theories of nature and theories of the natural world in the 19th century, and particularly the mid-19th century, and particularly if we're thinking about sort of deep time extinct animals and so on, then immediately the mind tends to go to Darwinian evolution and the debates around that from the middle decades of the 19th century onwards. And paleontologists are involved in that. They're very kind of involved within these disputes and within these discussions. But in terms of the main, or one of the major sort of scientific fields, or the main kind of research problems that paleontologists are particularly interested in, then this idea of biogeography, so animal distribution, what particular parts of the world are like, what particular animals are found in them, and how particular faunas are arranged around the world, is both a major area where paleontologists are particularly active. But I've also sort of come to the conclusion that this is a real major obsession for Victorian natural historians that hasn't really been studied very much. There's a very good book by Janet Brown that looks at biogeography, animal distribution for the early modern period, for the 18th up until the early 19th century. But questions and issues around animal distribution in the latter part of the 19th century hasn't really been looked at so much, despite it being something that prominent natural historians write a huge amount about. So this is a map of the world according to different zoological provinces, which is produced by Alfred Russel Wallace, who is also sort of also kind of credited as being the kind of the co-discoverer of the theory of evolution by natural selection. But in most of Wallace's actual writings and his publications, he's devoting himself to biogeography, to this question of why do particular animals live in particular areas, which to us might seem a bit kind of esoteric, but does become very, very important for a whole range of scholarly debates, also cultural debates, and also political debates across the 19th century. So this map is a bit kind of abstract, and this is a kind of from a quite high-level scientific text. But this is a series of maps from a more popularizing German work, Wilhelm Bosch's sort of animal migration in the kind of primordial world, where it's sort of dividing the world up into these kind of distinct kind of zoological provinces, and illustrating the types of animals which are particularly associated with these zoological provinces. And this becomes very important within the 19th century as a research, political, and kind of economic problem. Because firstly, just sort of understanding why particular animals live in particular places has a kind of a lot of scholarly importance, because it links with debates over animal distribution, it links with debates around animal history, and it links with just attempts to understand what nature and environment around the world is like. But then obviously if we sort of see maps like this from the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century, then the kind of colonial resonances of this are very, very difficult to sort of miss, because we have sort of parts of the world which are being subjected to European colonialism, being marked out as having very distinct qualities, very distinct characters, very distinct faunas, and these animals aren't just kind of representatives of the environment, but they're potentially resources to be sort of extracted, and so connected with colonial expansion, colonial control. So obviously elephant ivory is a major important one. The decimation of the buffalo in North America is another one, and so on. And so this is simultaneously a kind of intellectual ordering of the world, but it's also kind of subjecting the world to various forms of European conceptual, but also European kind of economic control and economic interest. And then another kind of important thing, and this is kind of connecting with my older work in the kind of history of racial and cultural thinking, is quite often these ideas about zoological and biogeographic provinces, they aren't just applied to animals, they're also applied to humans. And quite often each of different zoological provinces are conceptualized as having particular human types associated with them, whether these are thought of as being civilizations, whether these are thought of as being races. And so this is drawing quite directly from these studies of biogeography and studies of animal kind of distribution and animal migration and animal sort of location. So that's another part of the kind of issue which is very, very prominent within the text. Just to kind of zoom in a bit more on some particular examples around this, biogeography and these kind of attempts to understand animal distribution becomes particularly important for paleontologists because it becomes a field where understandings of the ancient prehistoric world and the modern world really do become very, very deeply enmeshed and deeply entangled in very important ways. So it becomes almost conceptually impossible to separate the history of animal life from the types of distribution, the type and where particular animals are living now. So this is a quote from Richard Lydekker, who's a very prominent, popular science writer and kind of researcher in the latter part of the 19th and early 20th century. And he talks about, to understand the present distribution of animals, it is essential to understand their past history as recorded by the preservation of fossilized remains in the strata of the Earth's crust. And he makes specific examples of kind of why tapirs, for example, are found in tropical America and the Malayan countries, and why marsupials are found in Australia and the Americas as being core examples and core fields of interest. And if we kind of zoom in and think about the sort of values which are put on some of these creatures, then we do see in quite important ways how paleontology becomes a very important means through which particular animals, but also entire environments, entire continents, are given values, are given sort of assumptions, and are kind of conceptually defined and mastered. So the example of tapirs might seem, that Lydekker brings up, might seem a bit sort of tangential and difficult to see why this is important. But tapirs become, in the 19th century, a very, very important conceptual animal for a large range of reasons, but all very much coming from this linkage between paleontology, studies of the deep fossil past, and modern animals. So on the one hand, we've got the kind of distribution of the animals. So you find several species of tapir in Central and South America and another species in Southeast Asia. So it's similar creatures but living quite far apart. And so this becomes a conceptual problem for scientists, scholars to think about. And this leads to a general sort of idea that if the tapirs are found in these two areas, then that isn't necessarily because they're just separate creations and so on. It means there must have been a much more wide extent of these creatures across pretty much the entirety of the world, between Southeast Asia, between Northern Asia, going through the Americas and through to South America, as a single zone of life inhabited by these creatures, which are now very much associated with a kind of rainforest environment. So bringing clues, bringing ideas about the deep history of particular environments and this entire swathe of the world. Another important thing around tapirs, and this is something which comes very strongly from paleontological discourse from the early 19th century onwards, is tapirs become regarded as a particularly primitive, and this is a term which is used a lot, particularly primitive, undeveloped, almost kind of germinal type of mammal. And this goes all the way back to the beginning of the 19th century, even late 18th century, and some very, very prominent studies by Georges Cuvier, so the very famous comparative anatomist working at the Jardin des Plantes in Paris, where he studies a range of animals from the Paris Basin, fossilized animals from a series of gypsum mines in Montmartre and so on, which are presented as being coming from right at the beginning of the Age of Mammals, so right at the beginning of the kind of originatory period, very presented as being very undifferentiated, but the analogy which he uses for the main group of them
them is the tapir. He regards these as being sort of pretty much equivalent as different sorts of animals. Which means that both the tapir becomes sort of enshrined as being a very primitive, undeveloped creature, but also means that it becomes an analogue for these earlier creatures, these earlier animals living in the depths of the Eocene in Europe. And this becomes a very, very important sort of issue because it then becomes part of the discourse or part of the conceptualization that the parts of the world which still have these undifferentiated animals, these undifferentiated germinal animals, must themselves also recapitulate earlier stages of evolution, earlier stages of development. So this means that this, what's called often the oriental zone of development of biogeography, so Southeast Asia, becomes conceptualized as being sort of primitive in terms of nature, and also South America in particular becomes marked off as this land of tropical sort of weirdness, extremity, and sort of distinctiveness. So in this respect, this kind of animal becomes emblematic for a whole load of different things. And on the one hand, it's kind of devalued as being a primitive, undeveloped creature. But on the other hand, it means that studying and investigating this particular animal becomes also valued in important ways. Because if you want to understand the origin of mammals in general, you need to go to creatures like the tapir, creatures like the marsupial, creatures which are kind of given this originatory sort of primitive status, because this is where all the remaining mammals came from. So it becomes this kind of weird ambivalence between, on the one hand, devaluing because of primitiveness and these kind of value-laden assumptions, but also kind of giving it a particular significance in solving particular riddles around the history of life. A similar sort of thing you can see around reconstructions of sloths, for example, which become subject of a lot of cultural valuations in the 19th century. So modern sloths are the subject of a great deal of kind of very culturally laden debate in the 19th century. Obviously, the word sloth comes from one of the 7 deadly sins, and that kind of association is not lost on religious and kind of Christian thinkers, that this is an animal which potentially shows the dangers of sin and a lazy life and so on, and potentially being a kind of moral lesson against not exerting yourself, or potentially also a degenerated creature, so a creature which has declined. And that's one potential view, but in terms of, there is kind of controversy over sloths in the 19th century, which does kind of draw off other views of natural history, and there are a few other kind of scholars and a few other kind of cultural presentations which say actually the sloth is perfectly suited for its kind of place in life and place in the sort of economy of creation. It needs to be sort of understood in terms of this kind of rainforest luxuriant environment. So sloths become very important for all of these kind of cultural debates, but they also become very, very important when linked with deep time chronologies and geological understandings of the natural world. Some of the earliest large fossils which are found and widely promoted in the latter part of the 18th century, after the kind of big upsurge in elephant fossils, are actually the fossils of giant sloths from South America. So the first one of these is shipped to Madrid from what's now Argentina in the 1780s and 1790s, is mounted in the Natural History Cabinet in Madrid, but then becomes a major focus of a lot of scholarly debates, a lot of kind of cultural interest. There's a really, really good book on the giant sloth by Juan Pimentel called the Rhinoceros and the Megatherium, which uses it as an example of how the natural world is constructed and debated in the 19th century. But it means that the kind of evolutionary developmental history of the sloth becomes an important way of thinking about changes in the natural world in South America and the natural world in general, because it shows on the one hand that the life of the past is existing on a much grander scale to the life of the present. So you have like these 5-meter tall sloths rather than the kind of modern 2-toed sloths, which is like that. And also it's important because it indicates that these biogeographic provinces, they're not just around in the present, but they also have their own individual histories, and each different part of the world has its own particular strand of development. So South America has current sloths, current tapirs and so on, but in the past, if you go back through the developmental history of the continent, you also find these parallel analogous creatures. So it means that each part of the world can be thought of as having its own distinct history, its own distinct pattern of development, and its own distinct values. And as the final sort of northern hemisphere zone, so basically this entire zone from Europe across northern Eurasia and into the Americas, is a uniquely productive, a uniquely dynamic, and a uniquely sort of progressive zone for the development of important animals like carnivores, most of the major herbivores, primates, rodents, and so on. And so these develop within this, sort of tempering area of kind of progress, and then spread out and conquer the rest of the world in this animal history, which is kind of recapitulating ideas of imperial history and so on. And so this is sort of naturalizing again this idea that the northern hemisphere, and particularly Europe, Eurasia, and North America, are the sort of home of progress, not just within the kind of contemporary imperial ideology, but this stretches all the way back to the Age of Mammals, when these creatures were sort of developing. So that's sort of one area, although there are sort of areas where this can also be contested. And so as the kind of final point, I don't think we'll have time for South Australia, unfortunately, but as a kind of final point relates to elephants and how elephants become a kind of group which shows a slightly different set of trends to this idea of northern dominance within biogeography. Elephants in the 19th century, and even before that and even after that, are regarded very often as uniquely interesting, as uniquely useful, as uniquely valuable, and as uniquely advanced types of animals. There's a very sort of widespread conceptualization which gets presented by sort of even classical writers like Pliny, for example, write that the elephant is the closest animal to humans. And this is something which, in terms of ideas about moral and emotional and kind of social context, really becomes almost a consistent theme within modern natural history discourse, this idea of the elephant as being this elevated kind of noble creature, which is sort of, which shows values and kind of higher consciousness in ways that lots of animals don't. So elephants become important for these cultural and kind of intellectual reasons, but then elephants also become very closely connected with economics and with colonial, various forms of colonial policy and colonial control. So obviously elephant hunting becomes a major issue, both in terms of the white male hunter becoming a sort of shooting an elephant as being sort of almost the pinnacle of the pinnacle which can be done, but also on a more industrial or more kind of economic side of things, just the trade in elephant ivory in the 19th century is just enormous, and so it becomes this huge industry. And then beyond that, in places like in South Asia, then elephants become really, really important for the colonial economy in terms of labour. So in terms of logging practices and so on, then working with elephants, controlling elephants, mastering elephants becomes a major part of colonial projects. And there's a really, really good article, and I think it's also in his book by Jonathan Saha, talking about elephant labour and elephant practices and elephant control as being a major kind of part of the colonial project within Burma. But elephants are also important, and this is another kind of connection with paleontological discourse, is in terms of just the extent of elephant fossils, fossil elephants, which can be found in pretty much every part of the world apart from Australia. They're usually quite recent, so it's quite straightforward to get relatively complete elephant fossils from most parts of the world. And this means that natural history museums in basically every part of the world will use local fossil elephants, or mastodons or related creatures, as iconic specimens within their displays. So the kind of fossil elephant, whether it's a mammoth or another sort of species, becoming a major icon, a major sort of feature within museum displays, is almost a kind of convention, is almost a cliche within natural history museums all over the world in this period. But this then sort of raises a kind of question in that in terms of the kind of origin of elephants and where sort of elephants come from, for most of the 19th century, this is almost an entire mystery. In the fossil record, elephants sort of suddenly seem to have appeared midway through the Age of Mammals in this huge range of diversity all over the world at once. And so this becomes a major question and a major sort of source of inspiration for all sorts of self-consciously organised expeditions throughout the 19th century. To cut a very long story short, a series of excavations in Egypt in the 1900s is credited with kind of solving the mystery of elephant evolution by finding this entire track of earlier fossil creatures, which are shown as moving through this very kind of serial development of elephant evolution, where you start off with this creature called Moratherium, which again is explicitly mentioned as being tapir-like, so again that kind of comes up again, but then moving through this series of stages to progressively become more and more elephant-like as it sort of moves. And an interesting thing about this particular image is it's another kind of piece by Henry Fairfield Osborn, so this very prominent American paleontologist, but for him the pinnacle of elephant development is actually this creature called the imperial or the Columbian mammoth, which is a North American elephant. So there's this idea that elephants reach their apogee on the North American continent. But this does almost sort of shift the valuation within biogeographic circles of the Northern Hemisphere being where all the kind of core progressive creatures come from, because this gives an African origin to elephants and presents this highly, highly privileged group as coming from a part of the world which obviously within contemporary natural history, historical discourse, within contemporary political discourse, is presented as being barbarous, savage. In many natural historical models, Africa is often presented earlier in the 19th century as almost being a dumping ground for kind of animals which had been driven to extinction in other parts of the world. But this assertion of the origin of elephants within Africa in these earlier periods does kind of shift things quite a bit, and you get a wider sort of assertion that Africa is actually an important generative place. It's where it's the home of many important animals, and it's somewhere where kind of wonders come from and where important progressive things within the animal world come from, and so almost shifts some of the geographic hierarchies which the dominant modes in biogeography present. And just as a kind of final thing, this is and to present how these things are kind of articulated within these very kind of simultaneously historical but also colonial and also military sort of discourses. This is a quote from Wilhelm Boelsche's book, Animal Migrations in the Primeval World, where he thinks about the migration of the elephants into North America. So they kind of almost literally in terms of the conquest of the world by the elephants. So he talks about how, it must have been a great sight in Earth history, the first appearance of the numerous herds of elephant, young and old together, their giant drooping ears, their constantly moving trunks, their bright trumpet calls moving to a whole new landscape. Africa on a world conquest. It is impossible to think of the later historical events of the Carthaginian Hannibal, who once again took African elephants over the Alps. So it's kind of naturalizing ideas about conquest, invasion, military sort of maneuvers, but putting it into this deep history, this deep antiquity, with the elephants becoming this icon of kind of dominance and almost the kind of the dominant creatures over the world before humans. Okay, I think I'm out of time there, so I'll leave it there. So thanks everyone for your attention, and I look forward to questions.